The Young and the Restless Spoilers. In the quiet corridors of Memorial Hospital, where the air seemed to hum with a mix of antiseptic and dread, the world of Nick and Sharon Newman had collapsed into a single, agonizing truth. Their son Noah lay unconscious, a fragile body tethered to beeping machines that kept time with their fear. For days, they had stood together at his bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, clinging to the faint rhythm as though it might answer the impossible question of why their lives had once again spiraled into tragedy. Noah's accident had come out of nowhere, late at night, on a stretch of road he had no reason to be on, and now doctors whispered about brain swelling and oxygen levels, about hope balanced precariously between science and prayer. For Nick, who had spent his adult life trying to shield his family from pain, the helplessness was unbearable. He paced the hospital hallways like a man searching for something that no longer existed: answers, control, maybe even redemption. He had built empires, faced down rivals, and made peace with enemies, but nothing could prepare him for the sight of his son broken and still, his vibrant energy reduced to silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the headlights, imagined the impact, the screech of tires. He wanted someone to blame. And yet, beneath the anger was a deeper fear, that maybe Noah hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe someone wanted him off that road altogether. Sharon, by contrast, had withdrawn into a fragile calm that unnerved those around her. She spent hours in the same chair beside Noah's bed, fingers brushing the edge of his blanket, whispering silent prayers. To anyone else she seemed composed, but beneath the surface her mind was unraveling. She replayed every conversation she'd had with Noah in the weeks before the crash, searching for clues she might have missed. He had seemed distracted, tense. There were moments he'd paused before answering questions, moments when she'd sensed something unspoken hovering between them. Now, with the beeping of machines filling the room, she realized how little she truly knew about her son's recent life. Her maternal instincts screamed that someone had driven him into danger, and yet there was no one she could accuse without proof. And so she sat, waiting, trapped in a purgatory of grief and guilt, while Nick struggled to keep himself from breaking. The tragedy had drawn them together again in ways neither could have predicted. For months, Nick and Sharon had danced around old feelings, two people orbiting the same grief and history but afraid to touch the pain that lay beneath. They had shared dinners for faith's sake, exchanged quiet smiles when they crossed paths in town, but there was always a distance, a boundary neither dared to cross. Now that distance had vanished. In the dim light of the hospital, surrounded by the faint hum of machines, they found themselves leaning on each other as if instinct had taken over. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was intimate in a way that frightened them both. When Sharon's hand trembled, Nick's found it without hesitation. When Nick's voice cracked with anger, Sharon's calmness anchored him. They spoke little, because words felt useless, but in the silence they found something close to peace, a fragile reminder of what they once were, and perhaps, what they could still be. Outside that small cocoon of shared pain, Genoa City continued to spin, indifferent to their suffering. But for Nick and Sharon, time had stopped. Every hour was measured by updates from doctors, every day by whether Noah's condition worsened or improved. The swelling in his brain was their new universe, the thing that dictated their every breath. And when the doctors finally said there was nothing more to do but wait, Nick's control cracked. He left the room in silence, walking aimlessly through the hospital corridors until he reached the parking lot, where the night air hit him like a wave. He stared up at the sky, trying to find meaning in the stars that offered none, and felt the crushing weight of fatherhood, of promises he'd made to protect his children, of failures he could not undo. Sharon found him there later, leaning against his car, eyes red from exhaustion. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. No words were necessary. They both knew the guilt the other carried, the endless what-ifs, the silent questions of whether they could have prevented this. When she reached out to touch his arm, he didn't pull away. For the first time in years, they stood together not as ex-lovers or co-parents, but as two souls stripped bare by loss. The hospital became a second home. Days turned into weeks, and every nurse knew their faces. They existed in a haze of coffee, sleepless nights, and whispered medical updates. Victor Newman had offered to fly in specialists, but Nick refused. He didn't want his father turning this tragedy into another battlefield for power. Sharon agreed. This was not about control, or pride, or business. It was about a mother and father waiting for their son to come back to them. Yet as the silence stretched on, a subtle change began to take root between them. Late at night, when they finally left the hospital to rest, they would find themselves sitting together in Sharon's living room, talking not just about Noah but about themselves, the years they had lost, the mistakes that had driven them apart, the love that had somehow survived every storm. Grief had stripped them of all defenses, and what remained was raw honesty. Nick admitted he didn't know how to function without fixing things, and Sharon confessed she didn't know how to stop feeling responsible for everyone's pain. Their connection, once fragile, began to feel inevitable again, like a thread that refused to break no matter how much time or tragedy had stretched it. Still, there was guilt. Moving closer in the shadow of Noah's coma felt wrong, almost selfish, and yet it was also the only thing keeping them from collapsing completely. Sharon's voice would tremble when she said goodnight, and Nick's hand would linger a second too long on her shoulder. Each touch carried the weight of years of love and loss. Neither dared to call it reconciliation, but both knew it was more than comfort. Meanwhile, the mystery surrounding Noah's accident continued to fester beneath the surface. Detectives hinted at the possibility of foul play, tire marks suggesting another vehicle, inconsistencies in the timeline, but no suspects emerged. Sharon couldn't shake the feeling that someone wanted Noah silenced, that his presence on that road had been no accident. Nick dismissed it at first, calling it the paranoia of a grieving mother, but deep down he felt it too. There had been secrets in Noah's recent life, business ventures, friendships, perhaps even a relationship he hadn't shared with them. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that their son might have stumbled into something darker than either parent imagined. This unspoken truth pushed Nick and Sharon further into each other's orbit. They became partners in more than grief, they became investigators of their own child's life. Together they combed through his phone records, retraced his steps, and questioned anyone who might have known what he was doing that night. The more they learned, the more it frightened them. Noah had been meeting someone, but who? And why the secrecy? The uncertainty became a cruel companion, feeding both their hope and their dread. On nights when exhaustion overtook them, they would fall asleep on Sharon's couch, still in their hospital clothes, her head on his shoulder, his hand unconsciously resting on hers. It wasn't passion that bound them, it was survival. They were two parents trying to keep breathing in a world that had stolen their son's voice. And yet, in those fragile moments, love began to bloom again, not in the fiery way it once had, but as something deeper, quieter, and more human. Weeks later, when Noah finally stirred, a flicker of movement, a whisper of breath that made every machine light up, their world shattered and reformed all at once. Sharon wept as if her body had been holding back oceans, and Nick held her, his own tears falling silently against her hair. It didn't matter what had happened before or what would come after. In that moment, they were a family again, broken but still standing. But as Noah's eyes slowly opened, the questions returned sharper than ever. The look in his gaze was distant, haunted. When the doctors said his memory might be fractured, Sharon felt the chill of a new mystery beginning. The road to healing would not be simple. There were still shadows waiting beyond the hospital walls, still truths neither parent was ready to face. And though Nick and Sharon clung to each other now, somewhere deep inside they both knew that the peace they had found in grief might not survive the light of day. For in Genoa City, nothing stayed buried forever, and love, no matter how strong, was always tested by the secrets it tried to protect. The quiet after Noah's accident left Nick and Sharon standing at a crossroads they hadn't expected to face again. For weeks, they had lived inside the sterile walls of the hospital, measuring their days by Noah's vital signs and the small fluctuations of hope that came and went like the shifting of light through blinds. Nothing outside that room mattered anymore, no rivalries, no careers, no unresolved arguments about the past. Their only focus was getting their son back. But grief has a strange way of rearranging hearts, and in the moments between exhaustion and prayer, something familiar began to stir between them again. They had been here before, countless times, always drawn together by crisis, always pulled apart when life resumed its relentless pace. Yet this time felt different, quieter, almost inevitable. They weren't chasing nostalgia or passion, they were simply holding on to the one person who understood the pain that was consuming them. Sharon had spent endless nights whispering to Noah, telling him stories from his childhood, trying to reach him through the fog of unconsciousness. Her voice, soft and trembling, carried a mixture of guilt and love that only a mother could know. Nick often stood at the doorway, watching her, unable to interrupt. He had seen her strength before, during Faith's illness, during the times they'd lost each other, but there was something in her quiet persistence that humbled him. It reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago, the one who could hold his world together even when everything was falling apart. When the doctor finally told them that Noah was stable but still unresponsive, they left the hospital together for the first time in days. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. They didn't need to speak, grief had made words redundant. Back at Sharon's house, they sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by photographs of a happier time. One picture, Noah's high school graduation, caught Nick's eye, and he reached for it, his thumb brushing over the frame. Sharon's hand came to rest on his, a simple gesture that spoke more than any confession could. For years they had fought the current that always pulled them back together, convincing themselves that moving on was healthier, that love between them was a beautiful but dangerous memory. Yet in that moment, all those walls seemed meaningless. They weren't exes or estranged partners anymore. They were two parents standing on the edge of despair, holding each other because no one else could understand the depth of this particular pain. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't romantic. It was survival. They fell asleep like that, still dressed, her head against his chest, his arm around her shoulders, both of them clinging to the illusion that everything might be okay if they just didn't let go. The next morning, a call from the hospital shattered the fragile stillness. Noah had woken up. The words hit Sharon first, and she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Nick froze for a heartbeat before grabbing his jacket, his mind torn between disbelief and relief so intense it felt like pain. The drive to the hospital was a blur, every traffic light a test of patience, every second too long. When they finally entered Noah's room, the sight of his eyes fluttering open was enough to undo them both. Sharon broke down completely, tears of joy and fear mixing as she clutched her son's hand. Nick stood at the foot of the bed, silent, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over, the waiting, the dread, the long nights of uncertainty, and yet something inside him had changed forever. In the days that followed, as Noah began to recover, Nick and Sharon found themselves navigating a strange in-between. They spent their time at the hospital together, finishing each other's sentences, comforting each other in the quiet moments when fear crept back in. The physical closeness that had once felt like a dangerous temptation now felt natural, even necessary. They weren't ready to define what they were, but they both knew that something had shifted. The night Noah regained consciousness, they returned to Sharon's home again, this time not because they needed rest, but because they couldn't bear to be apart. They talked for hours, about Noah, about life, about how fragile everything suddenly seemed. When Nick finally leaned in and kissed her, it wasn't an impulsive act of desire. It was a culmination of everything unspoken between them. The years of distance melted away in that moment, replaced by something deeper, more grounded. It wasn't about reliving the past, it was about surviving the present together. Yet even as warmth returned to their relationship, doubts lingered. They both knew that love between them had always come with consequences. They had broken each other's hearts too many times to believe that this would be simple. Nick feared that he was reaching for her out of grief, not clarity. Sharon worried that once Noah was truly safe, Nick would retreat again into the walls he built to protect himself from vulnerability. And yet, neither could deny the bond that had reawakened. It wasn't fiery or reckless like before, it was quiet, mature, and deeply rooted in shared pain. When they kissed again in Nice, during a brief trip meant to clear their heads, it felt like a circle closing. They had come so far, lost so much, and somehow found their way back to the beginning. The sunlight reflected on the water, and for the first time in years, Nick smiled without guilt. Sharon looked at him and saw not the man who had left her, but the one who had always come back. Back in Genoa City, the whispers began almost immediately. Friends, family, even Victor noticed the change. But Nick and Sharon said nothing. They weren't making declarations or promises, they were simply trying to breathe in the same rhythm again. As Noah's condition improved and he began to piece together memories of the night of his accident, they knew that the peace they'd found might not last. The mystery of what had happened to their son still loomed over them, a shadow that could just as easily tear them apart again. But for now, they chose not to think about it. They spent their evenings together, cooking dinner, sharing wine, letting laughter slip through the cracks of their exhaustion. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and Noah was asleep upstairs, Sharon would look at Nick and see traces of the man who had been her first love. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but maybe that was the point. They didn't need perfection anymore, just presence, understanding, and the courage to start over. Whether their reunion would last was a question neither dared to ask. The truth was that they didn't know if love between them could ever truly heal or if it was destined to keep reopening old wounds. But as long as they had each other, as long as Noah's heart kept beating, there was hope. And hope, fragile and luminous, was enough. It was the one thing that had always tied Nick and Sharon together, through every loss, every betrayal, every tragedy. Now, as they faced the uncertain road ahead, that same hope felt like the beginning of something new, not just for them as lovers, but as a family rediscovering what it meant to survive together.